Jackson Rivers sat alone at his usual table in the Rusty Spur saloon, his fingers tracing the rim of a steaming coffee mug when the rumble of motorcycles shattered the morning peace. The notorious Desert Vipers who'd been terrorizing businesses across 5 counties roared into the parking lot like a sandstorm. They had no idea the blind cowboy in the weathered Stetson was a legendary knife-throwing champion who'd performed in venues across 3 continents. The Rusty Spur Saloon stood proudly at the crossroads of Mesquite Drive and Canyon Road, its adobe walls weathered by decades of desert winds and scorching Arizona summers. The morning sun painted long shadows across the hand-laid terracotta tiles, their rich earthen hues a testament to the generations of ranchers, cowboys, and desert dwellers who'd crossed this threshold. The aroma of fresh brewed coffee mingled with the lingering scent of last night's mesquite wood fire, creating an atmosphere as authentically Western as the antique spurs adorning the walls. Jackson's acute hearing picked up the subtle symphony of the saloon's morning routine. Ice cubes clinking as Rosa Martinez, the owner, prepared the day's fresh lemonade. The gentle creak of ceiling fans spinning lazily overhead. The soft whisper of the desert breeze finding its way through the weather-stripped door. His sensitive fingers traced patterns in the well-worn wood of his table, reading the history of the place through its scratches and grooves, like others might read a morning paper. The handful of morning regulars moved through their familiar routines. Old Pete Wilson nursed his morning coffee at the bar, discussing cattle prices with Maria Santiago, whose family had ranched in the valley for 4 generations. Their voices carried the gentle cadence of people who measured time not by clocks, but by seasons and sunrise. Near the window, Tom Eaglefeather, the local veterinarian, enjoyed his usual breakfast of huevos rancheros, the plate carrying the distinctive scratch of Rosa's grandmother's recipe. At 42, Jackson cut an unusual figure in the saloon. His tall frame remained straight despite his blindness, and his movements carried the fluid grace of someone intimately familiar with their surroundings. The black bandana covering his eyes didn't hide the quiet dignity of his expression, and his hands, scarred from years of practice with throwing knives, told their own story of dedication and skill. His coffee cup never clinked against the saucer, a testament to the precise control he'd developed over the years. The locals had grown accustomed to Jackson's presence over the past 8 months, though he remained something of a mystery. They knew he'd lost his sight in an accident 5 years ago, but few knew the details of his former life as a professional knife thrower. His reputation in the circuit had been legendary. The Hawk, they'd called him, known for hitting targets, blindfolded long before he'd lost his sight. Now, he preferred the quiet life, teaching a select few students the art of knife throwing at his small ranch outside town. Rosa moved between tables with practiced ease, her silver-streaked black hair caught in a traditional braid. She'd owned the Rusty Spur for 20 years, inheriting it from her father, who transformed the former stagecoach station into a local institution. Her footsteps carried a unique pattern that Jackson could identify instantly, their rhythm as familiar to him as the sound of his own heartbeat. She paused at his table, the subtle scent of vanilla and cinnamon that always accompanied her presence, announcing her arrival before she spoke. The morning light streamed through the saloon's tall windows, creating patches of warmth that Jackson could feel on his skin. He'd learned to read the time of day by the way the sun's heat moved across the room, one of the many adaptations he'd made since losing his sight. His acute senses captured details others might miss, the slight unevenness in Tom Eaglefeather's breathing, suggesting he was fighting a cold, the way Maria's voice carried a note of worry when discussing cattle prices, the subtle change in air pressure that usually preceded a change in weather. The peaceful atmosphere of the Rusty Spur carried its own kind of music, the gentle clink of dishes from the kitchen, the soft murmur of conversation, the distant call of a red-tailed hawk soaring over the desert. Jackson's trained ear could Pick out each distinct sound, creating a detailed mental map of the space around him. His remaining senses had sharpened to extraordinary levels since losing his sight, turning his world into a complex tapestry of sounds, scents, and tactile sensations. The first distant rumble of motorcycles registered in Jackson's consciousness like an approaching storm. His fingers, still tracing the rim of his coffee cup, paused imperceptibly as he calculated distance and direction from the sound. Years of training had taught him to assess situations through sound alone, and something in the aggressive growl of those engines spoke of trouble approaching. The morning sun continued its steady climb, unaware that the peaceful routine of the rusty spur was about to be dramatically interrupted. The locals who frequented the rusty spur knew little about Jackson Rivers beyond his quiet demeanor and unfailing courtesy. His presence carried an air of mystery that seemed to complement the saloon's rustic charm. The black bandana covering his eyes bore intricate silver threading along its edges, a subtle hint of artistry that suggested there was more to the blind cowboy than met the eye. His weathered Stetson, tilted at a precise angle, shadowed features that remained remarkably expressive despite his blindness. Each morning, Jackson would arrive precisely at 7, his boots marking a steady rhythm across the terracotta tiles. He never used a cane or asked for assistance, moving through the space with an almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings. His ranch lay 5 miles outside town, yet he made the journey each day on horseback, guided by his mare Shadow, a black Arabian whose intelligence and training had become legendary among local ranchers. The sight of a blind man riding with such confidence had initially caused concern among townspeople, but time had proven Jackson more capable on horseback than most sighted riders. Today, he wore a crisp white shirt beneath a leather vest that had seen its share of desert storms. 3 small silver pins adorned the vest's lapel, awards from his competitive days that he kept as tactile reminders of his past achievements. His fingers, marked with the distinctive calluses of a knife thrower, moved with deliberate precision as he traced the geometric patterns carved into his custom-made coffee mug, a gift from Rosa, who understood his need for tactile landmarks. The story of how Jackson lost his sight remained a carefully guarded secret, though rumors occasionally circulated through the saloon. Some said it was a tragic accident during a performance in Las Vegas. Others whispered about a mysterious illness that had stolen his vision overnight. The truth, known only to Jackson and a handful of others, was far more complex. The scars that occasionally showed above his collar when he adjusted his bandana hinted at a violent event, but he never spoke of it, preferring to let the past rest undisturbed. Before blindness changed his life, Jackson had been known as the Hawk in professional circuits, famous for his ability to hit targets while blindfolded. His signature move involved throwing 5 knives simultaneously, each finding its mark with deadly accuracy. He'd performed in venues from Madison Square Garden to the Sydney Opera House, earning championships and breaking records that still stood. The irony wasn't lost on him that losing his sight had forced him to perfect the very skills he'd once performed as entertainment. Rosa approached his table with the quiet grace that characterized her movements, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. Her footsteps carried a slight hesitation today, something Jackson noticed immediately. "The weather's changing," she said softly, refilling his cup. "Storm coming in from the east." Jackson nodded, having already sensed the shift in barometric pressure that heralded approaching weather. His sensitivity to atmospheric changes had become nearly prophetic since losing his sight, earning him a reputation among local farmers who often sought his weather predictions. The morning sun had climbed higher, its warmth reaching through the windows to touch the collection of vintage photographs adorning the saloon's walls. Among them, barely visible in the growing light, hung a faded poster from Jackson's performing Days. The image showed a younger man, eyes bright with confidence, surrounded by a display of throwing knives arranged in perfect patterns around multiple targets. Rosa had found the poster in a box of old memorabilia and hung it quietly one evening, never mentioning it to Jackson, though she suspected he knew of its presence. Tom Eagle Feather watched Jackson from his corner table, his practiced medical eye noting the exceptional awareness the blind man displayed. As a veterinarian, he'd worked with injured animals enough to recognize when other senses developed to compensate for a loss. In Jackson's case, the compensation seemed almost supernatural. He'd once witnessed Jackson catch a falling glass before it shattered, his hand moving with impossible speed to snatch it from mid-air, guided only by the whisper of displaced air. The regular customers had grown accustomed to Jackson's daily routine. His arrival at 7, the precise way he arranged his space, the quiet hours he spent listening to the ebb and flow of conversation around him. What few realized was that every moment served as practice, each sound catalogued and analyzed, every movement in the room tracked and measured. His blindness had turned the entire world into a training ground, honing skills that had once been merely impressive into something extraordinary. The silver pins on Jackson's vest caught the morning light, throwing brief flashes across the room. Each represented a different championship: Prague 2015, Montreal 2016, and Tokyo 2017. He'd won his last title just months before losing his sight, though many who knew him claimed his skills had only improved since then. The demands of navigating a world of darkness had forced him to develop a level of spatial awareness that bordered on precognition, transforming his expertise with throwing knives from a performance art into an extension of his being. The Rusty Spurs morning crowd represented the heart of Copper Canyon's tight-knit community. Maria Santiago leaned against the bar's polished surface, her silver hair catching the desert light as she discussed the upcoming cattle auction with old Pete Wilson. Her family's ranch, the Double S, had weathered 3 generations of droughts and economic downturns, surviving through the kind of determination that defined the American Southwest. Pete's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug, his fingers bearing the calluses of 60 years working the land. Rosa Martinez moved between tables with the confidence of someone who'd made this space an extension of her own home. Her father, Eduardo, had purchased the saloon in 1980, when it was little more than a rundown roadhouse. Through decades of careful restoration and community building, the Rusty Spur had evolved into something between a community center and a living museum of the region's history. The antique spurs and vintage photographs adorning the walls told stories of cowboys, ranchers, and dreamers who'd shaped this corner of Arizona. Tom Eagle Feather's presence added another layer to the morning's familiar tableau. As the area's only large animal veterinarian, he carried the responsibility of tending to the livestock that sustained the region's economy. His traditional silver and turquoise bolo tie reflected his Navajo heritage, while his modern medical knowledge bridged the gap between ancient wisdom and contemporary science. He'd been one of the first to recognize the extraordinary nature of Jackson's abilities, having witnessed the blind cowboy's uncanny rapport with injured horses at his ranch. Through the front windows, the desert landscape stretched toward distant mesas, their red rock faces changing colors with the rising sun. A young barrel racer named Lucy Chen entered the saloon, bringing with her the enthusiasm of youth and the scent of leather and horse liniment. She'd been taking knife-throwing lessons from Jackson for the past 3 months, drawn by the discipline and focus the art required. Her arrival shifted the morning's energy slightly, adding a fresh current to the established rhythms of the regular crowd. The relationship between Jackson and his community had evolved gradually, like a desert flower slowly opening its petals. Initially, many had viewed his presence with a mixture of curiosity and concern, uncertain how to interact with the blind cowboy who carried himself with such quiet dignity. Over time, his acute awareness and gentle wisdom had earned him a unique place in their social fabric. Children would often seek him out, fascinated by his ability to identify them by their footsteps or the subtle patterns of their breathing. Olivia, running wolf, who taught history at the local high school, occupied her usual corner table near the vintage Wurlitzer jukebox. Her presence added an academic perspective to the morning discussions, her deep knowledge of regional history often providing context to current events. She'd been gathering oral histories from local families, preserving the stories that shaped their community. Jackson had become one of her most valuable sources, his keen ear for detail and remarkable memory helping to capture nuances others might miss. The morning light played across the hand-carved bar, its surface bearing the marks of countless elbows and stories shared. Deputy Grace Martinez, Rosa's niece, stepped through the door for her usual morning coffee, her badge catching the sunlight. Her arrival represented the newer generation of law enforcement, combining modern training with an understanding of local traditions. She developed a particular respect for Jackson after he'd helped locate a lost child last summer, his heightened senses proving more valuable than traditional search methods. The interactions between these morning regulars reflected years of shared experiences and mutual understanding. When Maria spoke of struggling with drought conditions, her words carried the weight of community concern. Old Pete's suggestions about water management drew from decades of hard-won knowledge, while Tom Eagle Feather offered insights that blended traditional wisdom with scientific understanding. Jackson listened to these exchanges with characteristic attention, his presence adding a contemplative depth to the discussions. Lucy Chen's youth and enthusiasm provided a counterpoint to the established patterns of the older regulars. Her questions about knife throwing often led to broader discussions about focus, discipline, and the importance of trusting one's instincts. Jackson's patient responses revealed the teacher beneath the quiet exterior, his explanations drawing parallels between the art of throwing knives and the larger challenges of life. The morning regulars had grown accustomed to these impromptu lessons, often finding wisdom in his carefully chosen words. The community's acceptance of Jackson went beyond mere tolerance or pity. They'd come to value his unique perspective and quiet strength, recognizing that his blindness had heightened other forms of perception. When he spoke of approaching weather changes or the mood of a troubled horse, people listened. His ability to read the subtle currents of human emotion through voice and movement had helped diffuse more than one tense situation, earning him the respect of both young and old. The distant rumble of motorcycles grew louder, their aggressive engines disrupting the morning peace of the Rusty Spur saloon. Jackson's trained ear identified at least 5 distinct machines, each purposefully modified to maximize their intimidating sound. The Desert Viper's reputation had spread through 5 counties like a poisonous wind, leaving a trail of frightened business owners and damaged properties in their wake. Their arrival in Copper Canyon had been inevitable, though few expected them on this quiet morning. Through the large front windows, the approaching riders appeared like dark specters against the desert landscape. Their chrome-laden machines caught the morning sun, throwing harsh reflections across the saloon's adobe walls. The lead rider, a massive figure whose leather cut bore the distinctive snake emblem of the Desert Vipers, guided his machine into the parking lot with deliberate showmanship. Behind him, 4 other riders followed in perfect formation, their synchronized movements suggesting military training corrupted for less honorable purposes. The atmosphere within the Rusty Spur transformed instantly. Old Pete Wilson's discussion of cattle prices with Maria Santiago died mid-sentence, their experienced eyes tracking the biker's arrival with practiced wariness. Deputy Grace Martinez subtly adjusted her position, her hand naturally falling closer to her service weapon. Tom Eagle Feather's casual breakfast transformed into a strategic observation post, his veteran's instincts recognizing the signs of impending confrontation. The lead rider dismounted with theatrical slowness, his movements calculated to draw attention. Standing well over 6 feet tall, his frame bore the bulk of someone who'd spent considerable time building intimidating mass. The snake tattoo that curved around his neck, its fangs extending onto his jaw, marked him as Marcus Sidewinder. Sloan, the Desert Viper's notorious leader, his reputation for calculated cruelty had earned him a thick file at the state police headquarters, though no charges had ever stuck. Following Sidewinder's lead, the other riders killed their engines in sequence, creating a cascade of dying rumbles that seemed to emphasize the sudden silence that followed. Each rider bore the distinctive patches and markers of the Desert Vipers, their leather cuts adorned with symbols that told stories of violence and territorial conquest. The morning sun cast their shadows long across the parking lot, like dark fingers reaching toward the saloon's entrance. Jackson remained perfectly still at his table, his acute senses painting a detailed picture of the unfolding scene. The subtle shifts in air pressure as the saloon's door opened, the distinctive pattern of heavy boots on terracotta tiles, the sharp scent of leather and motorcycle exhaust, each detail added to his understanding of the situation. His fingers maintained their casual trace around his coffee cup's rim, though his awareness had expanded to track every movement within the space. The second rider to enter stood lean and coiled, his movements carrying the practiced grace of a predator. Known only as Razor, his expertise with a blade had left its mark across 3 states. The third, a mountain of a man called Diesel, moved with surprising lightness for his size, positioning himself near the door with tactical precision. The fourth and fifth riders, twins known as Smoke and Mirrors, took up flanking positions with practiced efficiency. Rosa Martinez's silver-streaked braid swung gently as she turned to face the entrance, her stance betraying none of the concern she surely felt. The saloon had weathered its share of trouble over the years, but the Desert Vipers represented a different category of threat entirely. Their method of operations typically began with subtle intimidation before escalating to more direct forms of persuasion. The protection money they demanded often started reasonably enough, but their demands inevitably grew until businesses buckled under the pressure. Lucy Chen, the young barrel racer, had instinctively moved closer to Jackson's table, her youth and inexperience making her more visibly nervous than the older regulars. Olivia Running Wolf closed her notebook with deliberate calm, her historian's mind already documenting details for whatever story was about to unfold. The morning sun continued its climb, casting alternating patterns of light and shadow through the saloon's windows, creating an almost theatrical setting for the confrontation to come. The Desert Viper's reputation had been built on a foundation of calculated violence and strategic intimidation. Unlike common criminals, they operated with a quasi-military precision that spoke to their leader's background. Sidewinder had served in special operations before being dishonorably discharged, and he'd applied those tactical skills to building one of the most effective criminal organizations in the Southwest. Their presence in Copper Canyon marked a significant expansion of their territory, a move that would have serious implications for the entire region. Sidewinder's boots struck the terracotta tiles with deliberate force as he moved through the rusty spur, each step a calculated performance of dominance. His weathered face bore the hard lines of someone who'd abandoned mercy in favor of power, the snake tattoo on his neck seeming to writhe with each movement. The morning light caught the silver snake pendant hanging from his neck, throwing sinister reflections across the walls as he surveyed his newest territory. The Desert Viper's leader paused near the center of the room, allowing his presence to fill the space. His eyes moved methodically across the gathered locals, measuring reactions and cataloging potential threats with military precision. Razor flanked his left, thumb hooked in his belt near a concealed blade, while Diesel's massive frame effectively blocked the main entrance. The twins, Smoke and Mirrors, positioned themselves strategically near the bar, their identical features making it difficult to track their individual movements. "Quite a place you've got here." Sidewinder's voice carried the rough edge of authority, corrupted by cruelty. His gaze settled on Rosa Martinez, recognizing the owner's bearing and her proud stance. "Shame how dangerous these roads have gotten lately. All sorts of accidents waiting to happen." The threat in his words hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the morning atmosphere with its implications. Jackson remained motionless at his table, his acute senses building a detailed map of the unfolding situation. The subtle shift in Razor's weight suggested a man accustomed to quick violence, while Diesel's controlled breathing spoke of professional training. The twins moved with a synchronization that went beyond mere practice, their footsteps marking precise distances as they established control of the space. Rosa's voice cut through the tension with surprising strength. "We don't want any trouble here." Her words carried the weight of generations who defended this land against various forms of predation. The silver threads in her dark braid caught the morning light as she stood her ground, years of managing a frontier establishment evident in her steady gaze. Sidewinder's laugh held no genuine mirth, just the practiced sound of someone used to breaking resistance. "Trouble's such an ugly word. We're more like insurance agents, making sure nothing unfortunate happens to nice establishments like this." His hand traced the polished bar surface, fingers lingering near a vintage spur, mounted on display. "Our rates are reasonable considering the alternatives." Deputy Grace Martinez had maintained her position near the wall, her training warring with the knowledge that she was severely outnumbered. Her hand stayed close to her weapon, but drawing it would only escalate the situation beyond control. The morning sun through the windows caught her badge, a brief flash of official authority that seemed almost ironic in the face of such calculated lawlessness. Lucy Chen's nervous energy radiated across the room as she unconsciously edged closer to Jackson's table, seeking protection in his calm presence. The young barrel racer's movement drew Razor's attention, his predatory gaze tracking her with unsettling focus. The lean enforcer's hand never strayed far from his concealed blade, his fingers occasionally twitching with barely contained violence. Old. Pete Wilson and Maria Santiago remained at the bar, their years of frontier life having taught them when to stay still and when to move. Tom Eaglefeather's medical training allowed him to observe the scene with clinical detachment, noting the signs of approaching violence in the biker's subtle muscle tensions and positioning. Olivia Running Wolf's historian's mind captured details that would later fill pages in her notebook, assuming they all survived to document this morning. "Some places," Sidewinder continued, his voice dropping to a more menacing register, "try to resist our generous offer. Those situations tend to get messy." He moved closer to Rosa, using his height to loom over her smaller frame. "We'd hate to see anything happen to such a historic establishment. Fires, broken windows, accidents. The desert can be so unpredictable." The morning light streaming through the windows had taken on an almost harsh quality, casting stark shadows that emphasized the tension filling the saloon. The gentle whir of ceiling fans seemed to underscore the pregnant silence between threats, their shadows rotating across the floor like the hands of a clock counting down to inevitable violence. Jackson's fingers had stopped their movement around his coffee cup's rim, his heightened senses cataloging every sound and movement within the space. Years of performing had taught him to read audiences, to feel the currents of emotion flowing through a room. The desert vipers radiated a particular kind of violence, controlled, professional, and utterly without conscience. Their presence had transformed the familiar morning atmosphere of the rusty spur into something sharp and dangerous, like the moment before a rattlesnake strikes. Sidewinder's attention finally settled on Jackson, perhaps drawn by the blind man's unusual stillness amid the growing tension. The biker leader's eyes narrowed as he studied the black bandana, the weathered Stetson, the precisely positioned hands around the coffee cup. Something about Jackson's composed demeanor struck a discordant note in the carefully orchestrated scene of intimidation. "Well, what do we have here?" Sidewinder's boots marked a deliberate path across the terracotta tiles as he approached Jackson's table. "Seems we've got ourselves a genuine cowboy, blind one at that." His voice carried the cruel edge of someone who'd found what he assumed would be an easy target. "Must be tough, getting around in the dark. Lots of things to bump into, lots of accidents waiting to happen." The morning sun caught the silver pins on Jackson's vest, drawing unwanted attention to the awards he'd earned in another life. Razor's keen eyes noticed the distinctive calluses on Jackson's fingers, his professional interest in blade work causing him to lean forward slightly, studying the blind man's hands with growing curiosity. The twins, Smoke and Mirrors, exchanged glances, their identical features reflecting a shared recognition that something about this situation felt different. "Tokyo, 2017, Jackson spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone intimately familiar with tension. "World Championship Finals, 5,000 spectators in the Budokan Arena. The target spun at 30 revolutions per minute, positioned 40 feet away." His fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "I threw 5 knives, simultaneously, blindfolded. Each one struck within a quarter inch of its intended mark." The atmosphere in the rusty spur shifted subtly as Jackson continued. "Before that, Montreal 2016. The target moved in random patterns, controlled by computer. 7 knives thrown in sequence, each finding its home with perfect accuracy. The judges called it impossible. They checked my blindfold 3 times." His words painted pictures in the minds of everyone present, images of packed arenas and breathless crowds. Diesel's massive frame tensed slightly by the door, his military background allowing him to recognize the controlled precision in Jackson's voice. The mountain of a man had seen enough combat to know when he was in the presence of someone whose capabilities exceeded their appearance. The morning light through the windows cast his shadow long across the floor, stretching toward Jackson's table like a physical manifestation of growing uncertainty. "Prague, 2015, Jackson's narrative continued, each word measured and precise. "Exhibition performance for European royalty. The finale involved throwing knives through a spinning ring of fire, targeting points on a rotating wheel while suspended, upside down. The audience included 3 Special Forces commanders who later requested private demonstrations for their units." His revelation of military connections caused Sidewinder's jaw to tighten imperceptibly. Lucy Chen's nervous energy had transformed into something else, pride and anticipation. As Jackson's student, she'd heard fragments of these stories during their lessons, but never the full scope of his achievements. The young barrel racer's eyes darted between her mentor and the bikers, watching the subtle shift in power dynamics as Jackson's history unfolded. "But the most valuable lessons," Jackson added, his voice taking on a deeper resonance, "came after losing my sight. When darkness became my constant companion, every other sense heightened to compensate. I can track a person's position by the sound of their breathing, identify their intentions by the shift of their weight, feel the minute changes in air pressure that signal incoming movement." His words carried no threat, just the calm statement of facts. Rosa Martinez had known pieces of Jackson's story, but hearing it laid out so precisely made her understand why her father's old throwing knives, mounted on the wall behind the bar, had caught the blind man's attention the first day he'd entered the saloon. The vintage weapons, their handles worn smooth by decades of use, seemed to hum with renewed significance in the tense atmosphere. Deputy Grace Martinez processed this information with professional interest, her law enforcement training allowing her to appreciate the tactical implications of Jackson's capabilities. Her hand had moved slightly away from her weapon, recognizing that the situation might resolve itself in unexpected ways. The morning sun caught her badge again, its gleam somehow less urgent than before. Tom Eaglefeather's medical knowledge provided context for Jackson's enhanced sensory abilities. The veterinarian had studied cases of sensory compensation in both humans and animals, but never had he encountered someone who had turned such adaptation into an art form. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated the dust motes in the air, their dance becoming another data point in Jackson's extraordinary sensory awareness. Old Pete Wilson and Maria Santiago exchanged knowing looks, their years of frontier wisdom allowing them to recognize when a situation had shifted beyond its apparent parameters. Olivia Running Wolf's pen moved silently across her notebook, documenting what she sensed would become a significant chapter in local history. The gentle whir of ceiling fans continued their steady rhythm, accompanying Jackson's words like a subtle percussion section. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rusty Spurs floor as Sidewinder processed Jackson's words, the biker leader's confidence showing its first hairline cracks. The snake tattoo on his neck seemed to ripple as he swallowed, his theatrical dominance encountering an unexpected variable in the quiet blind man before him. Razor had shifted his stance subtly, professional interest warring with growing concern, as he recognized the implications of Jackson's capabilities. Impressive resume. Sidewinder attempted to maintain his threatening tone, though something had changed in his delivery. But circus tricks won't help you much out here in the real world. This is about business, not entertainment. His hand moved to rest on the back of a nearby chair, knuckles whitening slightly as he gripped the wood. Jackson's response emerged with the quiet precision of a blade, finding its mark. You're standing exactly 17 feet from my position. Your breathing suggests military training, probably special operations, but there's a slight hesitation in your left leg, an old injury that never healed properly. Razor, to your left, keeps his blade holstered at his right hip, standard quick-draw position, but his grip strength favors his left hand. The twins, Smoke and Mirrors, exchanged uneasy glances as Jackson continued. The two of you by the bar move in mirror patterns, suggesting extensive training together, but the one on the right, Smoke, I believe, has a slight asymmetry in his gait that becomes pronounced when he's tense. The morning light caught their identical features as they shifted uncomfortably, their synchronized movements faltering for the first time, and Diesel, Jackson's attention turned to the mountain of a man blocking the door. Your controlled breathing and precise positioning speak of professional training, but the way you distribute your weight suggests you're carrying a concealed weapon that you're not entirely comfortable with. Military men usually prefer weapons they know intimately. The atmosphere in the rusty spur had transformed entirely. Deputy Grace Martinez observed the scene with professional appreciation, recognizing how Jackson had systematically dismantled the biker's carefully constructed facade of invincibility. Tom Eaglefeather's medical knowledge allowed him to appreciate the extraordinary sensory adaptation Jackson demonstrated, while Olivia Running Wolf's pen moved silently across her notebook, capturing every detail of this remarkable confrontation. In the world of professional knife throwing, Jackson continued, his fingers still tracing the rim of his coffee cup, we learn to read more than just targets. We study the subtle tells that signal intent, the microscopic muscle movements that precede, Action. Losing my sight didn't end that study. It deepened it. Every sound, every shift in air pressure, every change in breathing patterns becomes data, painting a picture more detailed than most people can see with their eyes. Lucy Chen watched her mentor with newfound understanding, recognizing that their training sessions had barely scratched the surface of his capabilities. The young barrel racer's previous anxiety had transformed into something approaching awe as she witnessed Jackson's methodical deconstruction of the Desert Viper's intimidation tactics. Those championships you mentioned earlier, Sidewinder's voice carried a new edge of calculation. They prove you were good in controlled environments. But out here in the real world, things get messy, unpredictable. His attempt to regain control of the situation felt hollow, like a poker player realizing his bluff had been called. Unpredictable, Jackson's slight smile carried centuries of earned wisdom. Let me tell you about Unpredictable. Madison Square Garden, 2016. During the final round, a stage light exploded, sending shards of glass raining down. In the chaos that followed, I threw 7 knives through the falling debris, each finding its mark perfectly. The judges claimed it was impossible, but there's something they didn't understand. The morning sun had reached a point where it streamed directly through the saloon's windows, creating a natural spotlight on the scene. Jackson's next words emerged with quiet authority, each syllable precisely measured. When you live in darkness, chaos becomes your natural element. Every moment requires perfect awareness, perfect control. The world becomes a constant stream of information, air currents, sound waves, thermal variations. What seems unpredictable to others becomes a dance of patterns to those who know how to read them. Rosa Martinez watched from behind her bar, understanding blooming in her eyes as she recalled the countless times she'd seen Jackson navigate the saloon flawlessly, anticipating movements and avoiding collisions with seemingly impossible precision. The vintage throwing knives mounted on her wall caught the morning light, their well-worn handles speaking of years of dedicated practice. Jackson's right hand moved for the first time since the Desert Vipers had entered, reaching with deliberate slowness toward his vest pocket. The motion drew every eye in the room, tension crackling through the air like desert lightning. With precise movements, he withdrew a single throwing knife, its Damascus steel blade catching the morning light. The weapon's surface bore intricate patterns that seemed to flow like water, marking it as something far more refined than a mere circus prop. This blade, Jackson spoke while letting his fingers dance across the knife's surface, was forged by Master Tanaka in Seki City. The steel was folded over 1,000 times, creating layers thinner than paper. Each fold represents hours of meditation. Each pattern tells a story of patience and precision. The knife moved through his fingers with impossible grace, becoming almost invisible at times as it flowed through complex patterns. Sidewinder's hand had instinctively moved toward his own weapon, but Razor caught his leader's wrist with surprising speed. The lean enforcer's expertise with blades had taught him to recognize genuine mastery when he saw it. The morning sun, streaming through the windows, caught the knife's Damascus patterns, throwing hypnotic reflections across the saloon's walls. In the professional circuit, Jackson continued, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, we learn that the knife is merely an extension of intention. The blade follows the mind's path, seeking its target with inevitable precision. But here's what most people never understand. The true art isn't in hitting the target. It's in knowing exactly where everything and everyone is in relation to that target. Lucy Chen watched transfixed as her mentor manipulated the blade with fluid grace. In all their training sessions, she'd never seen this particular knife, never witnessed this level of artistry in its handling. The young barrel racer's breath caught as the weapon seemed to dance through impossible patterns, defying her understanding of physics and human limitation. For instance, Jackson's demonstration continued without pause. I can tell you that there are exactly 7 viable targets within my immediate reach. The support beam above Diesel's head would splinter in a way that would force him to abandon his position by the door. The vintage mirror behind Smoke would shatter in a particular pattern, creating a momentary distraction. The rope holding that antique chandelier has exactly 3 stress points that, if struck in sequence, would alter everyone's priorities rather dramatically. The morning sun had reached a position where it illuminated the knife's surface fully, transforming the blade into something that seemed almost alive in Jackson's hands. Deputy Grace Martinez found herself unconsciously holding her breath, her law enforcement training allowing her to appreciate the lethal poetry in every movement. Tom Eaglefeather's medical knowledge provided him with a unique appreciation for the precision of muscle control Jackson demonstrated, but more importantly, Jackson added, his voice taking on a deeper resonance, I can tell you exactly how each person in this room would react to sudden violence. Diesel's military training would drive him to seek cover while maintaining line of sight. The twins would move in their characteristic mirror patterns, but Smoke's slight asymmetry would create a momentary gap in their coordination. Razor's expertise with blades would make him the most immediate threat, but his left-hand dominance creates a predictable attack pattern. Sidewinder's confident facade had crumbled entirely, replaced by the calculating look of someone reassessing their tactical situation. The snake tattoo on his neck seemed less menacing now, more like a mark of borrowed ferocity faced with authentic mastery. The morning light caught beads of sweat forming on his forehead, betraying the stress beneath his attempted composure. The human body, Jackson continued his impromptu lesson, telegraphs its intentions in 1,000 subtle ways. The shift of weight that precedes aggressive movement, the change in breathing patterns that signals impending action, the microscopic muscle tensions that betray hostile intent. These are all books I've learned to read in the darkness. Your bodies are telling stories right now, stories of uncertainty and growing concern. Rosa Martinez watched from behind her bar, understanding blooming in her eyes as past moments clicked into place. Times when Jackson had seemingly anticipated trouble before it erupted. Instances where his quiet presence had diffused tense situations before they could escalate. The vintage throwing knives mounted on her wall seemed to hum with sympathetic energy as their modern cousin danced through its hypnotic patterns in Jackson's hands. You've built your reputation on fear. Jackson's words cut through the tension, with surgical precision, using the threat of violence to control others. But here's what you've failed to understand. True mastery isn't about causing harm. It's about having the ability to cause harm and choosing not to. It's about understanding the geometry of violence so completely that you can prevent it with minimal effort. The transformation in the Rusty Spur's atmosphere had become palpable as Jackson's Damascus blade continued its mesmerizing dance through the morning light. Sidewinder stood frozen, his carefully constructed world of intimidation crumbling in, the face of true mastery. The Desert Viper's leader found himself in unfamiliar territory, confronting someone whose power stemmed not from threats or violence, but from absolute control and perfect awareness. You know what's interesting about knife throwing? Jackson's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had transcended mere skill to achieve something approaching art. The moment of release is everything. That split second when you commit fully to the throw, knowing that once the blade leaves your hand, there's no taking it back. Every decision has its point of no return, Sidewinder. You're standing at yours right now. Razor's professional appreciation had transformed into something approaching reverence as he watched the knife weave impossible patterns through the air. His own considerable expertise with blades suddenly felt crude and unrefined in comparison. The morning sun caught the Damascus steel's intricate patterns, creating an almost hypnotic display that seemed to entrance everyone present. "In my world," Jackson continued, the knife never pausing in its fluid movement, "we understand that precision requires perfect balance. Physical balance, yes, but more importantly, balance of intent. The blade follows the mind's path, seeking harmony rather than destruction. Your world, built on fear and intimidation, lacks this fundamental balance. That's why it's destined to fall, one way or another." The twins, Smoke and Mirrors, had unconsciously shifted closer together, their usual synchronized movements now speaking more of seeking comfort than displaying coordination. Diesel's massive frame seemed to have deflated slightly, his military training allowing him to recognize when a situation had evolved beyond his capacity to control it. The morning light streaming through the windows cast their shadows in unfamiliar patterns, as if reality itself was adjusting to accommodate this shift in power. Lucy Chen watched her mentor with newfound understanding, recognizing that every lesson he'd taught her about knife throwing had been about much more than hitting targets. Each principle, balance, awareness, commitment, precision, carried deeper truths about life and power. The young barrel racer's earlier fear had transformed completely into admiration and pride in being this remarkable man's student. "Your reputation across 5 counties," Jackson's words cut through the tension like his knife through air, "is built on making people afraid of what you might do. My reputation, earned across 3 continents, was built on demonstrating what I can do with absolute certainty." The difference between these approaches is rather profound, don't you think? Deputy Grace Martinez observed the scene with professional appreciation, recognizing that she was witnessing a masterclass in non-violent conflict resolution. Tom Eaglefeather's medical knowledge allowed him to appreciate the extraordinary coordination between mind and body that Jackson displayed, while Olivia Running Wolf's pen moved silently across her notebook, documenting what she knew would become a defining moment in local history. "The human nervous system," Jackson added, his demonstration continuing without pause, "betrays intention before conscious thought can mask it. Right now, Razor's hand is twitching toward his blade, but his breathing pattern shows he won't draw it." Diesel's weight has shifted to his back foot, preparing for retreat rather than advance. The twins are experiencing elevated heart rates, their synchronized movements becoming increasingly erratic as stress disrupts their usual patterns. Rosa Martinez stood behind her bar, understanding blooming in her eyes as she witnessed the complete dismantling of the Desert Viper's carefully constructed facade of power. The vintage throwing knives mounted on her wall seemed to stand as silent witnesses to this demonstration of true mastery, their worn handles speaking of years of dedicated practice that had led to this moment. "But here's what's most interesting." Jackson's voice took on an almost contemplative tone. "I can hear the subtle changes in your breathing, Sidewinder. The slight catch when I mention precision, the unconscious swallow when I discuss balance. Your body is telling a story of recognition. You're beginning to understand that all your techniques of intimidation are merely shadows of real power." The morning sun had reached a point where it illuminated the entire scene with crystal clarity, casting no shadows where uncertainty could hide. The gentle whir of ceiling fans provided a steady rhythm to Jackson's demonstration, their movement creating subtle air currents that he read like Braille, maintaining perfect awareness of every presence in the room. The transformation within the rusty spur had reached its culmination as Sidewinder slowly raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. The Desert Viper's leader had encountered many forms of resistance during his reign of intimidation, but never anything that had so completely dismantled his power structure. The morning sun, streaming through the windows, illuminated a scene that would be remembered in Copper Canyon for generations to come. "Your reputation," Jackson spoke while smoothly returning his Damascus blade to its hidden pocket, won't survive. This encounter, regardless of what happens next, word will spread about how the Desert Vipers face something they couldn't intimidate, couldn't threaten, couldn't control. Every business owner in every town you've terrorized will hear about this morning, and they'll understand that your power was always an illusion. Razor had completely abandoned his aggressive stance, his expertise with blades making him perhaps the most qualified to appreciate the gulf between his skills and Jackson's mastery. The lean enforcer's hand had moved away from his weapon. His entire demeanor transformed from predator to reluctant witness. The morning light caught the edge of his own blade, making it seem almost crude in comparison to the artistry they just witnessed. "Boys," Sidewinder's voice carried the unfamiliar tone of someone choosing the better part of valor. "I believe we've made a significant miscalculation here." The snake tattoo on his neck seemed to have lost its menace, becoming merely decorative rather than threatening. His weathered features showed the strain of someone confronting the end of an era, the collapse of a carefully constructed world of fear. Lucy Chen watched with quiet pride as her mentor's influence rippled through the room. Every lesson about balance, precision, and awareness had led to this moment, though she'd never imagined seeing those principles applied with such devastating effectiveness. The young barrel racer's hand unconsciously touched the practice knife at her belt, understanding now that she was learning far more than just a performance art. Deputy Grace Martinez maintained her professional composure, though her law enforcement training allowed her to appreciate the elegance of what she'd witnessed. No violence, no arrests, just the precise application of presence and skill to neutralize a threat that had terrorized 5 counties. The morning sun caught her badge as she straightened, its gleam somehow more assured than before. In the professional circuit, Jackson continued, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "We learn that every performance changes the audience's perception of what's possible. Today, you've been part of a different kind of performance. The story that spreads from this morning won't be about violence or threats. It'll be about the day the Desert Vipers discovered the difference between appearing dangerous and being masterful." The twins, Smoke and Mirrors, had already begun edging toward the door, their synchronized movements now focused on strategic withdrawal rather than intimidation. Diesel's massive frame shifted to allow them passage, his own tactical assessment having concluded that retreat was the only viable option. The morning light caught their leather cuts as they moved, the snake emblems seeming to writhe with newfound uncertainty. Rosa Martinez watched from behind her bar, understanding blooming in her eyes as she witnessed the power of quiet mastery over brute force. The vintage throwing knives mounted on her wall had gained new significance, their worn handles telling stories of dedication and practice that led to moments like this. The morning sun streamed through her carefully cleaned windows, illuminating a scene of transformation rather than confrontation. Tom Eaglefeather observed with clinical interest as the Desert Vipers' coordinated unit began to dissolve, their carefully maintained facade of invincibility crumbling in the face of true skill. Olivia Running Wolf's pen moved steadily across her notebook, capturing details that would become part of local legend, understanding that she was witnessing a pivotal moment in the community's history. "Consider this a moment of opportunity." Jackson's words carried no threat, only wisdom earned through years of perfecting his art. "You can leave now, take your operation elsewhere, try to maintain what's left of your reputation. Or you can stay, escalate the situation, and discover exactly how many ways a blind man who's mastered the geometry of violence can rearrange your understanding of possibility." Old Pete Wilson and Maria Santiago exchanged knowing looks at the bar, their years of frontier wisdom allowing them to recognize watershed moments in their community's story. The morning light had reached a point where it filled the entire saloon, leaving no shadows for intimidation to hide within. transforming the rusty spur into a stage where the power of true mastery had prevailed over the illusion of threat. The departure of the Desert Vipers from the rusty spur carried none of the dramatic flair that had marked their arrival. Sidewinder led his men out with the careful dignity of someone who had learned a valuable lesson about the nature of true power. Their boots marked a quieter rhythm across the terracotta tiles, the sound of deflated bravado giving way to newfound wisdom. The morning sun caught their chrome-laden machines one final time as they mounted up, the gleam somehow less threatening than before. As the last echoes of motorcycle engines faded into the desert silence, the atmosphere within the rusty spur began to transform. The tension that had coiled through the space like a steel spring gradually unwound, replaced by something approaching: reverence. Rosa Martinez moved from behind her bar with the quiet grace that characterized her every action, approaching Jackson's table with fresh coffee and a deeper appreciation for the man who had become such an integral part of her establishment. "In all the years I've owned this place," Rosa spoke while refilling Jackson's cup, her voice carrying the weight of generations, "I've never seen anything quite like that. My father always said that true strength speaks softly, but I never fully understood until today." The morning light caught the silver threads in her braid, creating a halo effect that seemed to emphasize the significance of the moment. Lucy Chen had moved closer to her mentor's table, her young face alight with newfound understanding. The practice knife at her belt carried different meaning now, representing not just a skill to be learned, but a philosophy to be embraced. Every lesson, she realized aloud, every principle about balance and awareness. "You weren't just teaching me to throw knives, were you?" Jackson's slight smile carried decades of earned wisdom. "The blade is merely a tool," he explained, his fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on his coffee cup. "The true art lies in understanding the space between intention and action, in reading the subtle currents that flow through any situation." Today's demonstration wasn't about knives at all. It was about the power of perfect awareness over crude intimidation. Deputy Grace Martinez had maintained her position near the wall, but her professional demeanor had softened into something approaching admiration. "You just accomplished what 3 counties worth of law enforcement couldn't manage," she observed, her badge catching the morning light. "And you did it without a single act of violence, without even standing up from your coffee." Tom Eaglefeather's medical training provided unique insight into what they'd witnessed. "The human nervous system," he contributed from his corner, "can adapt in extraordinary ways to compensate for sensory loss. But what you've developed goes beyond mere compensation. It's something approaching evolution." The morning sun through the windows cast his shadow long across the floor as he spoke, emphasizing his words with natural drama. Olivia Runningwolf's pen had finally stopped its constant movement across her notebook, but her historian's mind continued to process the significance of what she documented. "This story," she said thoughtfully, "will become part of our local legend, not just because of what happened, but because of what it represents. The triumph of skill over force, of wisdom over intimidation." Old Pete Wilson and Maria Santiago had remained at the bar throughout the confrontation, their years of frontier life having taught them to recognize pivotal moments. "Reminds me of something my grandfather used to say," Pete offered, his weathered voice carrying across the quiet saloon. He claimed that true power doesn't need to announce itself, it simply is. Never understood that fully until today. The morning light had reached a point where it filled the entire saloon with a warm, honey-colored glow. The vintage throwing knives mounted on Rosa's wall caught this light differently now, transformed from mere decorations into symbols of a deeper truth about mastery and control. The gentle whir of ceiling fans provided a subtle harmony to the moment, their shadows rotating across the floor like the hands of a clock marking the beginning of a new era. "Those men," Jackson spoke again, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had proven so effective, "will spread the word about what happened here today. But more importantly, they'll carry the lesson with them, that true strength isn't found in causing fear, but in mastering oneself. Every town they might have, terrorized, will instead hear a story about the limits of intimidation when faced with genuine skill." The atmosphere within the Rusty Spur had been fundamentally altered, as if the very air had been charged with new possibility. Regular customers who had witnessed the confrontation found themselves processing not just what they'd seen, but what it meant for their community. The desert itself seemed to have paused to acknowledge the moment, the morning breeze carrying the scent of sage and promise through the open windows. As the morning sun climbed higher over Copper Canyon, news of what had transpired at the Rusty Spur began spreading through the community like wildfire. The story moved from person to person, each telling adding new layers of appreciation for how a blind knife thrower had transformed their town's future without rising from his morning coffee. The Desert Viper's departure marked more than just the end of a confrontation. It signaled the beginning of a new chapter in the region's history. Lucy Chen stood near her mentor's table, practice knife in hand, understanding now that each lesson had carried deeper significance. "I've been thinking about what you said during training," she spoke thoughtfully, "about how the target isn't just the point where the knife lands, but the entire space between thrower and destination. That's what today was really about, wasn't it? The space between intention and impact." Jackson's slight smile carried the weight of appreciation for his student's insight. "Every throw tells a story," he responded, his fingers still tracing patterns in the condensation on his coffee cup. "The blade's path through air, the rotation, the moment of impact, these are just visible elements of a larger truth. What happened today wasn't about intimidation or force. It was about understanding the geometry of possibility." Rosa Martinez moved through her saloon with renewed purpose, her silver-streaked braid catching the morning light as she tended to her customers. The vintage throwing knives mounted on her wall had gained almost mythical status in the space of a single morning. Their worn handles now telling stories of dedication that transcended mere practice. She paused near Jackson's table, the coffee pot in her hand, a familiar comfort in a world that had shifted on its axis. "My father believed in the power of gathering places," she reflected, her voice carrying generations of wisdom. "He said that saloons like this weren't just businesses, they were crossroads where community spirit could either flourish or wither. Today, you've helped it flourish in ways he could never have imagined." The morning sunlight streaming through her carefully, cleaned windows seemed to emphasize her words, casting patterns across the terracotta tiles that spoke of transformation and renewal. Deputy Grace Martinez had begun making notes for her official report, though she knew that no amount of professional language could fully capture what she'd witnessed. "The implications of this morning will reach far beyond Copper Canyon," she observed. "Every law enforcement office in 3 states has been trying to build cases against the Desert Vipers. Their sudden departure and the story behind it will change the dynamics across the entire region." Tom Eaglefeather's medical expertise had given him unique insight into the extraordinary abilities Jackson had demonstrated. "The human brain's capacity for adaptation is remarkable," he contributed from his corner. "But what we witnessed today goes beyond simple compensation for lost sight. You've developed something entirely new, a different way of perceiving and interacting with the world. Olivia Running Wolf's notebook had filled several pages with detailed observations, her historian's instincts recognizing the significance of documenting this pivotal moment. Stories like this, she explained, become touchstones for communities. Years from now, people will talk about the morning when a blind knife thrower taught everyone the true meaning of power and precision. Old Pete Wilson and Maria Santiago had switched from discussing cattle prices to contemplating the morning's events, their years of frontier wisdom providing valuable perspective. In all my years ranching, Maria offered, I've learned that the strongest fence isn't the one with the most barbed wire, it's the one built with the most care and precision. Seems that principle applies to protecting communities as well. The morning light filled the rusty spur with an almost ethereal quality as regular customers began filtering in, drawn by rumors of what had transpired. Each new arrival brought fresh energy to the space, their presence transforming the saloon from a site of confrontation into a celebration of community resilience. The ceiling fans continued their gentle rotation, their shadows dancing across the floor like nature's own choreography. Jackson's acute senses picked up the subtle changes in the saloon's atmosphere, the shift from tension to relief, from fear to possibility. His fingers moved across the surface of his coffee cup with the same precision that had made him a champion, reading the moment through touch as clearly as others might through sight. Change, he observed quietly, often comes not from grand gestures, but from small moments of perfect clarity. Lucy Chen had begun practicing with her knife, her movements carrying new purpose after witnessing her mentor's demonstration. The young barrel racer's dedication had taken on deeper meaning, understanding now that she wasn't just learning a skill, but embracing a philosophy that could transform lives. The morning sun caught the blade as it spun through careful arcs, each rotation a testament to the power of focused intention. The desert breeze carried the scent of sage and promise through the saloon's open windows, mixing with the familiar aromas of coffee and history. Rosa's careful maintenance of the space seemed more significant now, each polished surface and thoughtful arrangement contributing to an environment where extraordinary moments could unfold. The vintage spurs and photographs adorning the walls had gained new meaning, their presence connecting past traditions to future possibilities. The most valuable lesson in knife throwing, Jackson shared with his growing audience, isn't about hitting targets. It's about understanding that every action carries consequences beyond its immediate impact. The Desert Vipers learned that lesson today, though not in the way they expected. Their departure marks the beginning of something new, a realization that true power flows from mastery rather than menace. As the morning progressed, the rusty spur became more than just a saloon. It transformed into a symbol of community resilience and the triumph of skill over force. The terracotta tiles had witnessed countless stories over the years, but none quite like this. A tale of how quiet expertise had overcome brute intimidation, how perfect awareness had proved more powerful than any threat. The story of what transpired at the Rusty Spur that morning spread across 5 counties with the speed and intensity of a desert wildfire. Within days, business owners who had lived under the shadow of the Desert Viper's intimidation began standing taller, finding courage in the tale of a blind knife thrower who had demonstrated the difference between true mastery and mere menace. The saloon itself had become something of a pilgrimage site, drawing visitors from neighboring towns who wanted to see where the legendary confrontation had taken place. 2 weeks after the encounter, Jackson sat at his usual table, the morning sun warming his face through the windows as he conducted one of his increasingly popular knife-throwing classes. Lucy Chen had been joined by 5 new students, each drawn by the stories of his extraordinary demonstration of skill and control. The young barrel racer had taken on the role of assistant instructor, her own understanding of the art deepening as she helped others grasp the fundamental principles. The knife, Jackson explained to his attentive audience, is simply a focal point for something much larger. Each throw is a conversation between intention and possibility, between the thrower and the infinite points of space through which the blade must travel. His Damascus steel blade caught the light as he demonstrated, its intricate patterns seeming to flow like water as it spun through perfect arcs before embedding itself in the specially constructed target. Rosa Martinez had transformed one wall of the saloon into a proper throwing range during off hours, the vintage knives now accompanied by marks of serious practice. The sound of blades finding their marks had become part of the Rusty Spur's daily rhythm, as natural as the whir of ceiling fans or the clink of coffee cups. The morning light streamed through windows that somehow seemed clearer, as if the entire establishment had awakened to new purpose. Deputy Grace Martinez reported that criminal activity across the region had dropped significantly since word of the confrontation spread. The Desert Viper's departure had created a vacuum, but unlike nature's tendency to fill such spaces with new threats, this void was being filled with something else, a growing sense of community empowerment. The troublemakers who might have seen opportunity in the Viper's absence instead found themselves facing towns that had learned valuable lessons about the nature of true strength. Tom Eaglefeather had begun incorporating some of Jackson's teachings about awareness and precision into his veterinary practice, finding that the principles of perfect attention translated well to animal care. His patients seemed to respond to the calm certainty he now cultivated, and other vets from neighboring counties had started consulting him about his innovative approaches to treatment. Olivia Running Wolf's detailed account of the confrontation had been published in the regional newspaper, earning her attention from several publishers interested in expanding the story into a book. Her careful documentation of that morning had captured not just the events, but the underlying principles that had made them possible. The historian found herself increasingly focused on how communities transform themselves through moments of collective revelation. The physical changes to the Rusty Spur reflected its evolution into something more than just a local gathering place. Rosa had installed subtle lighting that highlighted the knife-throwing range, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere during evening practice sessions. The vintage spurs and photographs still adorned the walls, but they now shared space with carefully mounted targets and educational displays about the art of knife throwing. Lucy Chen's dedication to mastering the craft had inspired other young people in the community. The sight of a blind instructor teaching precise, potentially lethal skills had challenged assumptions about disability and capability. Parents who might once have worried about their children learning knife throwing now saw it as a path to developing focus, discipline, and deeper understanding of themselves. Every blade has its own voice, Jackson would tell his students, running his sensitive fingers along the edge of his Damascus knife. Each rotation through space tells its own story. The art isn't in making the knife do what you want, it's in learning to listen to what the knife wants to do naturally, then aligning your intention with that truth. His words carried layers of meaning that extended far beyond the technical aspects of throwing. The morning sun painted long shadows across the terracotta tiles as Jackson conducted his lessons, each throw accompanied by precise explanations of the physical and mental principles involved. His students learned to feel the subtle air currents that could affect a blade's path, to understand the relationship between rotation and distance, to recognize the importance of perfect balance in both the knife and the thrower. Old Pete Wilson and Maria Santiago had become regular observers of these sessions, finding wisdom in Jackson's teachings that applied to their ranching operations. The principles of reading subtle signs, maintaining perfect awareness, and acting with precision rather than force had proven valuable in handling livestock and managing land. Their presence added gravitas to the classes, their years of practical experience helping to ground abstract concepts in real-world application. The transformation of the rusty spur reflected larger changes rippling through Copper Canyon and beyond. Business owners who had once lived in fear of protection rackets now spoke openly about standing together against intimidation. The Desert Viper's sudden departure had shown that even the most entrenched systems of fear could be dismantled by the right combination of skill, wisdom, and quiet courage. Tourists passing through would often pause their journeys to visit the saloon, drawn by growing rumors of the blind knife thrower who had changed the course of a community's history. They found more than just a colorful local legend. They discovered a living example of how mastery and principle could overcome brute force and intimidation. Each visit added new layers to the story, transforming a single morning's confrontation into something approaching mythology. 1 month after the Desert Viper's departure, the Rusty Spur Saloon hosted a special evening demonstration that brought together the entire community. Jackson stood before a packed house, his Damascus steel blade catching the carefully arranged spotlights as he prepared to share the full extent of his mastery. The transformed space hummed with anticipation, every surface polished to perfection. By Rosa Martinez's meticulous care, ladies and gentlemen, Lucy Chen addressed the crowd, her voice carrying the confidence she'd developed through weeks of intensive training. What you're about to witness isn't just a display of skill with throwing knives. It's a demonstration of what's possible when perfect awareness meets absolute precision. The young barrel racer had grown into her role as Jackson's lead student, her understanding of the art deepening with each passing day. The evening's performance began with Jackson demonstrating the basic principles that had captured the Desert Viper's attention that fateful morning. His blade danced through increasingly complex patterns, each throw accompanied by explanations that transformed technical excellence into practical wisdom. The audience watched in rapt attention as he hit targets while identifying their positions, purely through sound, spinning multiple blades in harmonious patterns that seemed to defy physics. Deputy Grace Martinez sat in the front row, her official presence representing more than just law enforcement interest. She'd begun incorporating Jackson's teachings about awareness and precision into her department's training programs, finding that his principles about reading situations through subtle cues had practical applications in peacekeeping. Other law enforcement agencies had started sending observers to learn these innovative approaches to community protection. Tom Eagle Feather had brought several colleagues from neighboring counties, veterinarians who'd heard about how he'd adapted Jackson's teachings to animal care. They watched with professional interest as the blind knife thrower demonstrated how perfect awareness could be achieved through multiple senses, their medical minds processing the implications for their own work. The evening light through the windows cast their shadows long across the floor, mixing with the specialized lighting Rosa had installed for such demonstrations. Olivia Running Wolf's notebook lay open before her, but she'd stopped writing to simply absorb the scene. Her forthcoming book about the transformation of Copper Canyon had already attracted national attention, with publishers recognizing that this story transcended simple local interest. The historian understood that she was documenting not just a series of events, but a fundamental shift in how communities could respond to intimidation and fear. The special demonstration included elements that hadn't been seen during the confrontation with the Desert Vipers. Jackson worked with multiple knives simultaneously, creating patterns in the air that looked like flowing water caught in the spotlights. His expertise had evolved beyond simple target hitting into something approaching performance art, though. Every movement carried practical applications that his students eagerly noted. The key to mastery, Jackson explained between demonstrations, isn't in developing extraordinary abilities, it's in understanding that ordinary abilities, refined through perfect attention and practice, become extraordinary. His words resonated through the packed saloon, carrying meaning for everyone from ranchers to business owners, law enforcement to medical professionals. Rosa Martinez watched from behind her bar, pride evident in her bearing as she observed how her father's saloon had evolved into something he could never have imagined. The vintage throwing knives still held their place of honor on the wall, but they'd been joined by photographs and news clippings documenting the saloon's new role in the community. The morning sun through the windows caught these additions, creating a timeline of transformation that told its own story. Old Pete Wilson and Maria Santiago had brought several neighboring ranchers to the demonstration, people who'd initially been skeptical about the practical value of knife-throwing principles. As they watched Jackson work with his students, demonstrating how awareness and precision could be applied to any skill, their skepticism transformed into understanding. The principles of reading subtle signs and responding with measured precision resonated with their own experiences managing land and livestock. The evening's highlight came when Jackson worked with his advanced students, including Lucy Chen, to demonstrate synchronized throwing patterns that turned martial skill into visual poetry. The coordinated display showed how individual mastery could be amplified through cooperation, creating something greater than the sum of its parts. The audience watched in amazed silence as knives wove complex patterns through the air, each blade finding its mark with inevitable precision. Word of the Rusty Spur's transformation had spread far beyond the immediate region. Journalists from state newspapers had begun arriving to document the phenomenon, attracted by stories of how a blind knife thrower had sparked a revolution in community empowerment. Their articles captured the technical aspects of Jackson's skill, but often missed the deeper significance of what was happening in Copper Canyon, the emergence of a new understanding about the relationship between power and mastery. The Desert Viper's departure had created ripples that continued to spread across the Southwest. Other communities facing similar intimidation had begun reaching out to Copper Canyon, seeking guidance on how to transform fear into strength. Jackson's teachings about awareness, precision, and the geometry of possibility had found applications far beyond their original context, inspiring people to reconsider their approach to confronting intimidation. As the special demonstration drew to a close, Jackson offered a final display that left the audience in stunned silence. Working purely by sound and air currents, he created a complex pattern of throws that resulted in a perfect outline of a desert hawk on the target board. The image, formed entirely by precisely placed knives, seemed to symbolize the transformation of the community, from prey to protector, from victim to master of its own destiny. 6 months after the confrontation that changed Copper Canyon forever, the Rusty Spur Saloon had become a symbol of transformation, recognized across the American Southwest. The morning sun still streamed through Rosa Martinez's carefully cleaned windows, but it now illuminated a space that had evolved far beyond its original purpose. What had once been a simple gathering place had become a center for learning, growth, and community empowerment. Jackson's daily knife-throwing classes had expanded into a comprehensive program that attracted students from across 3 states. The blind master had developed a curriculum that went beyond mere technical instruction, incorporating principles of awareness, precision, and personal mastery that applied to all aspects of life. His original student, Lucy Chen, had become an instructor in her own right, her natural talent for teaching, helping to spread these transformative lessons to an ever-growing audience. The art of the blade, Jackson explained to a group of visiting law enforcement officers, is really the art of understanding space and intention. Every movement, every action carries consequences that ripple far beyond the immediate moment. His Damascus steel knife caught the morning light as he demonstrated, its intricate pattern seeming to flow like water as it spun through perfect arcs before finding its mark with inevitable precision. Deputy Grace Martinez had implemented a new training program for regional law enforcement based on the principles she'd learned from observing Jackson's methods. Officers from 3 counties now regularly attended seminars at the Rusty Spur, learning how to read situations through subtle cues and respond with measured precision rather than force. The results had been remarkable. Reported incidents of violent confrontation had dropped significantly across the region. Tom Eagle Feather's veterinary practice had been transformed by the integration of Jackson's teachings about awareness and precision. He'd published several papers in professional journals about his innovative approach to animal care, drawing attention from veterinary schools across the country. The gentle veterinarian often credited the blind knife thrower with helping him discover new ways to understand and treat his patients. Olivia Runningwolf's book about the transformation of Copper Canyon had become a national bestseller, attracting attention from sociologists and community development experts nationwide. Her careful documentation of how one community had overcome intimidation through skill and wisdom rather than force had sparked discussions about alternative approaches to dealing with systemic violence. The historian found herself increasingly in demand as a speaker at conferences, focusing on community empowerment and social change. Rosa Martinez had embraced her saloon's evolution with characteristic grace, adapting the space to serve its new role while maintaining its essential character as a community gathering place. The vintage throwing knives still held their place of honor on the wall, but they'd been joined by educational displays, training equipment, and photographs documenting the saloon's transformation. The morning regulars still enjoyed their coffee and conversation, now sharing space with students practicing their forms, and visitors studying the principles of perfect awareness. Old Pete Wilson and Maria Santiago had become unofficial ambassadors for the program, their practical experience helping to translate Jackson's abstract principles into applications for ranch management and animal handling. Their success in implementing these methods had attracted attention from agricultural programs at several universities, leading to studies on how principles of awareness and precision could improve traditional farming and ranching practices. The Desert Viper's departure had created a ripple effect across the region, as other communities facing similar challenges began to recognize that power built on fear was inherently unstable. Jackson's teaching about the geometry of possibility had provided a framework for understanding how to transform intimidation into opportunity, fear into mastery. The morning sun through the Rusty Spur's windows now illuminated a space where this transformation was not just taught, but lived every day. Lucy Chen's development as an instructor had become a story in itself, attracting attention from educational researchers interested in how traditional martial arts principles could be adapted for modern learning environments. The young barrel racer had discovered that her experience in both arenas, competitive riding and knife throwing, provided unique insights into the relationship between precision, awareness, and mastery. Her classes now included elements of both disciplines, creating a unique approach to personal development. The special evening demonstrations that had begun as simple displays of skill had evolved into complex performances that combined art, education, and philosophy. Jackson and his advanced students would weave patterns of flying steel through the air while explaining the principles that made such precision possible. These events regularly drew visitors from across the country, each performance adding new layers to the legend of the blind knife thrower who had transformed a community. International attention had begun to focus on the phenomenon occurring in Copper Canyon. Documentary filmmakers from Europe and Asia had visited the Rusty Spur, captivated by the story of how martial skill had been transformed into a vehicle for social change. Their cameras captured the physical demonstrations but struggled to convey the deeper transformation that had occurred, the fundamental shift in how the community understood the relationship between power and mastery. 1 year after the morning that changed everything, the Rusty Spur Saloon hosted an international symposium on community transformation through mastery. Representatives from 12 countries filled the expanded space, which now included a dedicated training arena, while still maintaining its character as a working saloon. The morning sun streamed through stained glass windows that Rosa Martinez had commissioned, each panel depicting scenes from the story that had brought them all together. Jackson stood at the center of the training area, his Damascus steel blade catching light from both natural and artificial sources as he prepared to demonstrate the principles that had sparked a global movement. Lucy Chen, now recognized as a master instructor in her own right, stood beside him, her presence representing the next generation of teachers who would carry these lessons forward. The young woman's journey from student to teacher had become a story almost as compelling as Jackson's own. "The principles we teach here," Jackson addressed the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had disarmed the Desert Vipers a year ago, "extend far beyond the art of throwing knives. Perfect awareness, precise action, and the understanding of space and consequence. These are universal truths that apply to every aspect of life and community." His blade danced through the air as he spoke, creating patterns that seemed to illustrate his words. The symposium had drawn an extraordinary mix of participants. Law enforcement officials from 3 continents shared space with martial arts masters from Asia. Community organizers from Europe discussed strategy with ranchers from South America, and academics from prestigious universities took notes alongside local business owners. The Rusty Spur's transformation from local gathering place to international center of learning was complete, though Rosa had ensured it never lost its essential character as a community hub. Deputy Grace Martinez presented data showing how the implementation of Jackson's principles had transformed law enforcement across the region. Violent confrontations had dropped by 70%, while successful conflict resolution had increased dramatically. Her presentation included body camera footage showing officers using awareness and precision to defuse potentially dangerous situations. Their actions reflecting the lessons learned from the blind knife thrower, Tom Eaglefeather's veterinary techniques, developed through applying Jackson's teachings to animal care, had been adopted by clinics across 4 continents. The gentle veterinarian had discovered that the principles of perfect awareness translated beautifully to understanding and treating animals, leading to breakthrough approaches in handling difficult cases. His methods had become standard curriculum in several prestigious veterinary schools. Olivia Running-Wolf's documentation of the community's transformation had sparked a new field of academic study focusing on the relationship between individual mastery and social change. Her latest book, exploring how the principles demonstrated at the Rusty Spur could be applied to various community challenges, had been translated into 15 languages. The historian found herself increasingly focused on documenting similar transformations occurring in communities around the world. Lucy Chen's innovative teaching methods, combining elements of knife throwing with barrel racing principles, had attracted attention from educational theorists interested in how physical mastery could enhance cognitive development. Her students demonstrated remarkable improvements, not just in throwing accuracy, but in academic performance and emotional regulation. The young instructor had begun developing programs specifically designed for at-risk youth, using the principles of awareness and precision to help them find direction and purpose. The Desert Viper's departure had created an unexpected ripple effect across the criminal landscape. Other organizations, witnessing how quickly a reputation built on fear could crumble when faced with true mastery, had begun reconsidering their approaches. Several former members of similar groups had even sought training at the Rusty Spur, looking to transform their lives through the discipline and focus that Jackson taught. International media coverage had transformed the story of the blind knife thrower into something approaching modern mythology. But those who studied at the Rusty Spur discovered that the reality was even more remarkable than the legend. Jackson's ability to read situations through subtle cues, to understand the geometry of possibility in any confrontation, and to teach these skills to others had proven reproducible and practical in countless contexts. The morning sun painted patterns across the terracotta tiles as Jackson worked with advanced students, demonstrating how principles of perfect awareness could be applied in various situations. The vintage throwing knives mounted on the wall watched over these sessions like silent witnesses to the evolution of an art form, their worn handles speaking of the years of practice that led to true mastery. 18 months after the confrontation that reshaped Copper Canyon, the Rusty Spur Saloon had evolved into something its original founders could never have imagined. The establishment hosted its first global summit on transformative mastery, drawing participants from 23 countries. The morning sun filtered through the new glass dome Rosa Martinez had installed above the training area, creating natural spotlights that seemed to dance across the assembled masters and students. Jackson stood at the center of the gathering, his Damascus steel blade catching both sunlight and artificial illumination as he prepared to share the culmination of his life's work. The black bandana covering his eyes had become a symbol recognized worldwide, representing the triumph of inner vision over external limitations. Beside him, Lucy Chen had matured into a formidable presence herself, her integration of knife-throwing principles with traditional Western disciplines having created an entirely new school of thought. The journey we began that morning, Jackson addressed the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the weight of earned wisdom, was never about confrontation or victory. It was about understanding that true power flows from perfect awareness, and that mastery isn't about domination, but about harmony with possibility. His blade moved through the air as he spoke, creating patterns that seemed to illustrate universal principles rather than mere physical skill. The summit had attracted an extraordinary gathering of minds and talents. Military strategists discussed conflict resolution with meditation masters, quantum physicists explored parallels between particle behavior and Jackson's principles of spatial awareness, while psychologists studied how his teaching methods could be applied to trauma recovery. The Rusty Spur had become a crucible where different disciplines merged and transformed, creating new approaches to ancient challenges. Deputy Grace Martinez presented the latest data from a nationwide study of law enforcement agencies that had implemented Jackson's principles. The results were staggering. Departments using these methods reported dramatic reductions in violent confrontations, improved community relations, and enhanced officer wellness. Her presentation included live demonstrations of how awareness-based policing had transformed potentially deadly situations into opportunities for community healing. Tom Eagle Feathers Veterinary Institute, now affiliated with 3 major universities, had revolutionized animal care through the application of Jackson's principles. The gentle veterinarian had discovered that perfect awareness transcended species barriers, leading to breakthrough treatments for previously unmanageable conditions. His methods had attracted attention from human medicine practitioners who recognized parallels with their own work in trauma and rehabilitation. Olivia Running-Wolf's academic work had spawned a new field of study, examining the relationship between individual mastery and societal transformation. Her research team had documented similar phenomena emerging in communities across the globe, each inspired by the story of the blind knife thrower, but adapted to local conditions and needs. The historian found herself increasingly focused on identifying patterns of positive change that could be replicated in different cultural contexts. Lucy Chen's youth development program had expanded to 30 countries, using the principles of precision and awareness to help young people find direction and purpose. Her innovative combination of Western and Eastern disciplines had created a framework that transcended cultural boundaries while respecting local traditions. The young instructor's journey from student to global teacher had become a model for personal transformation through dedicated practice. The Desert Viper's former territory had transformed into a corridor of community renewal, with towns that had once lived in fear now hosting their own training centers based on Jackson's principles. Several former members of similar organizations had become instructors themselves, using their understanding of intimidation dynamics to help others break free from cycles of fear and violence. The ripple effects of that morning's confrontation had created waves of positive change that continued to spread. Rosa Martinez had embraced her saloon's evolution while maintaining its essential character as a community gathering place. The vintage throwing knives still held their place of honor, but they now shared space with artifacts and testimonials from around the world. The morning regulars still enjoyed their coffee and conversation, their presence grounding the International Center in its roots as a local haven. Old Pete Wilson and Maria Santiago had become respected voices in the global conversation about practical applications of mastery principles. Their experience in translating abstract concepts into workable solutions for ranch management had proved invaluable as the movement spread to other agricultural communities. Their success had attracted attention from sustainable development organizations looking to integrate traditional wisdom with modern efficiency. The morning sun painted ever-changing patterns across the Rusty Spur's terracotta tiles as Jackson worked with an international group of advanced students. Each throw of his Damascus blade demonstrated not just physical skill, but the deeper principles that had transformed a local confrontation into a global movement. The gentle whir of ceiling fans mixed with the sound of multiple languages as participants shared their experiences and insights. If this story of the blind knife thrower touched you and showed you something about the true nature of power and mastery, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. We share powerful stories like this one regularly, each revealing extraordinary moments where quiet strength transforms lives and communities. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message of hope and transformation, share it with them. We've saved something special for tomorrow's video that you won't want to miss. Click the notification bell to ensure you're among the first to experience our next powerful story. Your support helps us continue bringing these meaningful narratives to light, reminding everyone that true strength often comes from the most unexpected places. Until our next story, remember Jackson's wisdom. Real power isn't about intimidation. Nay, it's about mastery of ourselves and understanding the geometry of possibility in every situation. Subscribe now and join us on this journey of discovery through stories that change how we see the world.